we tried to find all the micro schools we could. And there is recent work from the National Microschooling Center that estimates that there are about 95,000 micro schools. Well, with online searches, we were able to find 271.
Get out.
Because these are just small communities of families in most cases, and they don't have an online presence. They don't need an online presence. It's not worth their time or resources.
Welcome to Quality Matters, where we speak with experts across industries to see how their perspectives can inform our pursuit of high-quality education for all students. I'm Shaka, and this is Caitlin, and we're happy to be your guides for this limited series.
Like you, Shaka and I are passionate about all students having access to a great education, and quality is a driving force behind our work. But what does quality really mean? In an era where parents can customize their child's education, this question is more important than ever.
During each session, we'll hear from leaders in education, technology, business, sports, and the arts. We hope to apply their insights to our pursuit of a great education in the K-12 space.
Join us on this journey to secure a great education for all children. This is Quality Matters. All right, well, good morning. We are at the Emerging School Models Conference. We're really excited to be here today. Year two. I know, we were invited back. Today we're with Lauren Covelli. She is the Associate Policy Researcher at RAND, and you're doing really interesting things, super relevant to the conference. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Micro schools, the impact of micro schools, what they're doing, how students are engaging with them, how the rest of the world is reacting to them. Do you want to give us a little overview as to what you're excited about, what you're working on right now?
Sure. So this week I'm here to share sort of phase 2 of our micro schools work at RAND. Phase 1 came out in March, and that is when we really tried to just describe the lay of the land of the sector. We found all the information that we could out there. And we did our own surveys and interviews with micro school leaders to capture some original data as well about what's going on out there. And then we really tried to think through in that report what the implications might be for researchers who want to study this space. It's very exciting because there isn't a lot of work in this area, but the movement is growing really rapidly, so it's getting a lot of attention. And that sort of sparks the interest of researchers who want to develop more of an evidentiary basis for this new exciting school model that folks are really interested in.
Yeah, that's good. So can you give us, what's the current state of play in the research space when it comes to, measuring the impact of micro schools, sort of tracking and monitoring student progress? Because as compared to conventional schools, now you're not just talking about one district or one even state system. You've got this atomized system and they're all over the place. So yeah, what is the landscape right now?
Great question. So in our first report, one of the things we did ask folks about in surveys and interviews is what they're doing to measure student growth, student progress, measure academic achievement. We did find that a lot of schools are using standardized assessments. In a lot of cases, those are optional. Parents do not have to have their kids take them if they don't want to. We also find that letter grade-based report cards are still really common in micro schools, but generally, micro schools' approach to assessing students is highly individualized in the same way that their approach to teaching and learning typically is. So in a given micro school, for example, what is an A for one student may not be an A for another student at all, because those letter-based grades are really focused on the individual student's baseline, trajectory, the goals for that specific student. We also find that a lot of micro schools use observation-based feedback for students, as well as portfolio-based feedback. And in those cases, there would often be a very long, detailed narrative available for parents from the child's teachers about how the child is doing on all sorts of things. So that information is really useful for parents. But generally, systematically, there is no systematic data on these students that is out there.
So That's so interesting. Obviously, quality matters. We talk about quality as it pertains to the education space and then also many different sectors. And some of what you're talking about is reminding me of some of the conversations we've had with people in the hospitality space. So, you know, the individualized approach, like if you had a restaurant that was Mexican food or if you had a restaurant that was Indian food, like you're not going to have the immediate same criteria for each of the different restaurants, but you're going to create this measurement of quality depending on what they're serving and sort of how the customers are experiencing it. Long-winded way of saying, at some point there does have to be sort of this continuity across all students receiving an education. And so how are people in the micro school world sort of adapting to making sure that there's some consistency in all the different pockets, and so that all of the kids are eventually reading by a certain time or reading at all or whatever that looks like, or maybe there isn't. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I would say right now there generally isn't.
Okay.
But I can tell you a little bit about what we know.
Okay.
So most information that we have about micro schools is anecdotal, right? If you talk to folks in the sector, they're very enthusiastic about it. They have a lot to say. Parents tend to be very satisfied. There's also anecdotal stories out there that you may have seen in the media or otherwise where there are sort of flops, right? Mm-hmm. Where someone wants to start a micro school, but they don't have the capacity to navigate the potential regulations, or they're not well prepared enough, and then those families get let down. The other information that we have comes from the types of surveys and interviews that we did at RAND. Those have also been done by other school choice organizations like the National Microschooling Center, for example. Mm-hmm. And that is useful information for us about the sector, but it is not representative of the sector. So there are going to be certain micro school leaders that are engaged with these national communities and that are willing to talk to researchers and are willing to share their time and information with us. And those are not necessarily going to be representative of the sort of larger picture of one-off, small, localized micro school cooperatives or homeschool cooperatives. The third piece of information that we have is from large micro school networks, especially those that operate on a virtual platform. So, for example, Prenda Learning, where they have students across the nation who are all using a common platform to take standardized assessments. So they are able to report on growth of their students.
Because there's some standardization across their network.
That's correct, yes. However, students who opt into that type of large virtual learning environment are also not representative of the vast variation that there is across the sector. Sure. And just looking at those students in Prenda, for example, doesn't give us a counterfactual of how they would have done if they had stayed in their traditional setting, or how other students would do if they took those assessments. Other students in other micro school settings took those assessments. So the evidence really stops there. There's no causal, rigorous, systematic evidence on the impacts of micro schools at this time.
I think this is the best part and also the trickiest part because there's it's so individualized, it's so customizable, it's so particular, it's so unique, it's directly meeting the needs of the students that it's serving. And I want to know what the results are going to be, what the impacts are, what the actual measurement of the achievements are. But it's kind of one of those things, and you mentioned something right at the beginning of what you were just saying, parent satisfaction. And if these parents are all continuing to show their satisfaction, continue to engage their children in these schooling options, on one hand, is that the measure of quality that matters? That these parents are continuing to engage and share their kids? I loved that. That was so helpful.
Yeah, it feels like it's a measure. I don't know. Maybe it's not the measure.
Right.
Maybe there are lots of these measures. I mean, one of the things it sounds like, Lauren, is if you are familiar with one micro school, you're familiar with one micro school, right? And that there's not yet any micro school that could claim to be representative of the whole ecosystem, right? Because they're so different probably within a city, you could get lots of different models and whatnot. So when given your research background and your career, what differences exist when you're trying to evaluate this new emerging space versus when you're studying and researchers are still studying the conventional school system, a big, say, public school district? What do you have to adapt? What do you have to do differently? What are some of the considerations when evaluating one versus the other?
Great question. So first, I would say the data availability, which I alluded to before, is the biggest difference, right? Every kid in public school is in the state information system. We have longitudinal data on them over time. And a lot of times, impact studies, they rely on those data sets post-observationally. We can get all of that information on students. Microschool students are not in those data sets.
Right.
If they are in those data sets because they're attending a micro school that's operated within a district, which does happen, or if they're in the data set because they're registered as homeschooled, we still have no way of knowing that that homeschool student or that district student is actually engaged with the micro school. So they're very difficult to identify in administrative data. They're also difficult to identify just in general. So in the work that I'm presenting tomorrow at this conference, and our next paper, which is coming out in November, we tried to find all the micro schools we could. And there is recent work from the National Microschooling Center that estimates that there are about 95,000 microschools. Okay. Well, with online searches, we were able to find 271.
Get out.
Because these are just small communities of families in most cases, and they don't have an online presence. They don't need an online presence. It's not worth their time or resources. That's not, how they're functioning. So it's difficult to track people down in general. I think we found the best way to connect with the community is through organizations like the National Microschooling Center. I think those types of partnerships are really important for building relationships with sector leaders such that evaluations can even potentially be possible. The other thing is that the conventional school sector is all held accountable to a certain set of standards through their state accountability systems, right? And federal law requires that the largest portion of those accountability systems are student academic achievement. And micro schools exist outside of that regulatory space, and they don't have the same requirements about testing. As we were saying, they measure student progress in all sorts of different ways. Some of them do engage with state assessments, certainly, but even if they do, they don't have the same accountability strings tied to the results on those assessments. And also in terms of the sort of diversity of the sector, by nature, it is deinstitutionalized and decentralized, and a lot of micro school leaders and families have different priorities than academic achievement. Learning is still certainly, of course, going to be a key part of these schools, right. But a lot of families opt into the sector because they're more concerned with critical thinking skills. They're more concerned with social and emotional development. They're more concerned with whatever ways their child has been marginalized in the traditional system and hasn't been able to thrive, and they need a different environment. So we can't just apply the same outcomes as if they hold equal value in this other space. And we have to figure out more creative ways to work with sector leaders to design studies that are aligned to the values and the varied values of folks working there.
And are people, at least at some schools, measuring some of those additional, whether they're non-academic, outcomes, or maybe just different academic outcomes from the ones that are measured in say a public school system? Like, are there some micro schools that are doing that or attempting to?
Yes,
at least?
there are. Through student surveys, through family surveys. Prenda is another example that in addition to their standardized academic piece, they also have a different framework for assessing student progress that's more qualitative and based on sort of the core values of their model that is not related to academics. So yes, a lot of folks are doing that in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, that's kind of been a consistent theme, this idea of non-academic priorities in a lot of these emerging school models and some of the conversations we've had. So it's really neat to hear you talk about how that captures. Okay, what you just shared, finding 200 instead of 95,000. Like, you guys are clearly doing really impressive research. Your ways of acquiring this information is impressive. What suggestions or advice do you have for other people? This is totally an emerging sector, like, and it's going to continue to grow, hopefully. And so I'm curious, as we sort of equip other people to empower them to be able to learn more about this space, do you have suggestions for how to do research in this kind of unique niche area? And what might you share about
Yeah, you
that?
don't have to give us the trade secrets, but this is something that, yeah, to Caitlin's point, people want to know, whether it's policymakers, parents want to be able to evaluate, hey, this is a space that didn't even exist when we were going through school. So how do I make decisions? And therefore, we're going to need some research to come alongside and inform us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the first thing I would recommend to researchers is that they need to be very upfront about the limitations of the inferences that can be drawn from their work. Research products typically have a short limitation section at the end that acknowledges the limitations of the work. In the microschool space, what we're doing at RAND is the bottom line up front is the limitations. Like, that needs to sort of be a main takeaway, that work in this space needs to be specific to the context that it's being done in, and needs to not be generalized to draw larger inferences that are not appropriate, in the same way that we could do in large school systems where we have comprehensive data on the population and we know that everyone is operating within a common structure. You can't do that here. And the other piece of advice I would say is that research practice partnerships are going to be critical for work being done well in this area. I think researchers need to bridge the gap to sector leaders.
Okay.
They need to do things like come here and talk to all of the school leaders that are coming to conferences like this. My colleague at RAND attended the National Microschooling Conference and met a lot of people that helped us with our research there.
Yeah.
And if research agendas in this space and studies are designed collaboratively, then they can be aligned to the values of individual microschools. They can have the methodological rigor that researchers can bring to the space. And then they can be mutually beneficial to both the researcher and the practitioner. So as researchers, it's our goal to find evidence in this new emerging space and share that knowledge in a responsible way that's useful for consumers and that they can take into their practice.
Yeah.
For practitioners, it's also useful to engage in a meaningful evaluation system that can help you improve your practice and can help you communicate to your external stakeholders how you're doing.
Yeah, which I think a lot of school leaders want to do, but just because you are a school leader doesn't necessarily mean that it probably often means that you're not a researcher, right? So you may not know about research methods and practices. And on the other hand, it sounds like you're saying to your research colleagues, hey, get out of the lab and sort of go, see the work, or at least speak to the people who are doing the work and get some of that, on the ground, whether it's, anecdotal data or whatever, qualitative stuff, to see how this is really working in practice. That you can't just rely on massive CSV files, downloaded from the state. Yeah. Okay, that's super interesting.
I love hearing all about this. Is there, and I love that you were able to share some of those insights with other people, and hopefully, clearly the community is important, whether it's, making connections at these conferences, making connections out in the field, and actually engaging. There's lots of dynamic relationships. Just to wrap us up, is there anything top of mind that has you stoked and excited, sort of, in what you're learning and what you're researching and what you're seeing and what you at RAND are doing? What's sort of fueling your fire right now?
Yeah, I think for me, there are a handful of other researchers doing work in this space or starting to do work in this space. And they've all reached out to us and we've connected with them. And that is really exciting to me, that we are we have our small little micro school research community where we are talking to each other, we're peer reviewing each other's work, and we're learning from each other about how to do this better. So there will be exciting forthcoming work coming from some other folks in the coming years, and I'm really excited about that, and I'm really excited that we're sharing knowledge along the way.
More of that. We need a lot more
100%.
of this enthusiasm to like share what you're learning and reach out and make connections, so that everybody, we can all be elevated in the work that we're doing on behalf of students, on behalf of these families.
Yeah. Well, Lauren, thanks so much for having this conversation with us.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is, it's apropos that we're at this Emerging School Models conference, but this research sector is emerging. And so, yeah, I'm encouraged, I know Caitlin is too, that it's a collaborative thing. And so I think we're going to only see gains and benefit students if it's the kind of thing where we're sharing best practices and information across the sector. So thanks for being with us for this conversation.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Lauren.
All right, Caitlin, so that was a really interesting conversation that we had with Lauren Covelli from the RAND Corporation talking about micro schools. And why don't you jump in? What's something that struck you from that interview?
Yeah, I thought so much of what she shared, being a policy researcher, having a focus on micro schools, was different than some of the conversations we've had in the past, which I loved. This big picture, this broad scope and awareness that she had on micro schools, how they're being assessed, what the engagement looks like, was just fascinating to me. So I really appreciated her approach and her perspective. To me, one of the big takeaways was we really don't know sort of how the progress and the quality of some of these micro schools is being assessed. We don't have like the perfect way to measure it. And a huge part of why we don't have that is because the essence of micro schools means that they're unique, they're niche, they're small, they're modular, they're constantly shifting.
Yeah.
And so you can't really put your finger on it.
Right.
And so it's like the best part, kind of like what I said in the conversation, it's both the part that thrills me the most about this new concept and like frustrates me simultaneously, because it's the nature of how they exist makes it really difficult to measure them at large, to compare them, to understand them, really.
Yeah, it reminds me of the website Etsy. If you're familiar with that, probably a lot of our audience is familiar with that. You can find all sorts of like handcrafted things, whatever. But you go on Etsy and you search for something like a jewelry, some kind of gift, and you realize just how many people are out there independently making their own unique things.
Yep.
And it can be a little bit overwhelming. And it also means that no one Etsy shop is representative of all of the jewelry that's on that platform.
Definitely.
Right? In the same way, no one micro school is representative of the entire sector, because what did Lauren say? 200,000 micro schools is what her team, kind of found around the country. That's
what her
wild.
team found in response to being told that there were only 95,000. So it was
95,000 would have been a lot.
Right.
Yeah.
And 95,000 sort of indicates this amount of schools, that micro schools that are have the programming, have the internet space, have the website, have sort of this.
They're like out there and known.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then the reality is that there are so many more.
Right.
And they're popping up.
Right.
Continuously.
Which I think is an indicator of certainly of demand. Right? I mean, you don't have 200,000 of these sort of associations happening around the country if there's no demand.
Yeah, what a great takeaway. Totally.
That wouldn't make sense at all. So clearly the demand is there. So to the extent that we're looking for indicators of quality, certainly like there is some parent-driven demand.
Yep.
I would also say that there is this education entrepreneurship that's happening, right? Because it's a little bit like starting a small business.
Yep.
It takes a lot of energy to go from 0 to 1.
Yeah.
And, to start a school where there was none is a big deal. Much harder than coming into a school and being another one of 40 teachers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's hard, but starting a school by yourself is really challenging. So definitely those are some indicators. I do hope though that like her team is able to kind of help us think more about like what are the domains in which we're assessing quality, because she talked about some of those non-academic things too.
Right.
And I do think parents want to know about that stuff. They want to know, how are my kids doing, when it comes to outcomes beyond their mastery of math skills and English skills. Yeah
What you're talking about is making me think of sort of the end of that part of the conversation where we sort of spoke to her about when she has clearly been a successful researcher, and what sort of ideas does she have to share with other people, and what is she excited about? And I loved her response. She had a theme of it across both responses. This idea of coming together, partnerships, of working together with other people. And she had the approach as a researcher, you have to partner with the people that are out in the field actually engaging in the work and doing, boots on the ground.
Yep.
She also said one of the things that's most exciting to her is this idea that she has people in her orbit, other research organizations and entities that are engaging with her, reaching out to her. So there's such a collaborative approach right now to capturing what this information is, or what information is available.
Yep.
And maybe that just double underlines the point you made earlier about this need, this what was the word you used? The demand.
Yeah.
And so there's not only demand because there are parents engaging, there are people starting their own micro schools, but there's a demand, there's a hunger for information about this entity. And that is showcased by people engaging in work collaboratively, wanting to share their efforts collaboratively, wanting to learn more about this entity at large. So lots of high energy.
Well, it also makes me think, as we sort of break down that episode and try to apply it to what else is happening in K-12 education, it makes me think that there's got to be communication between policymakers, the research community, and then practitioners when we're talking about measuring, especially in this emerging space, these, non-conventional schools, and now, so many families are participating in them because of choice programs. There's got to be communication between at least those three groups. I would also put parents in there as a fourth, because what we don't want is policymakers creating and outlining their definitions of quality in the absence of conversations with practitioners and with the research community and with families, because then you end up measuring things that nobody actually cares about.
Right.
And
You're
we do
off the
spend
mark
plenty
entirely.
of time doing that. Yeah, we spend plenty of time doing things like, for instance, seat time. What are we talking about? Seat time or 180 days like in the school year? Like that. This stuff is not necessarily additive, right? And we care much more about mastering content than we do, well, what did the kids show up for the requisite number of minutes every week? I don't know. That's not valuable.
No, that's exactly right. And Lauren even used the quote, it's useful but not representative, which can be interpreted different ways. But in what you were just describing, some of this information, some of these measurements, they are useful, but what is it that they're representing? And they're not representative of maybe the actual, they're not representative of some of these measures that really do indicate quality of the education experience, of the interest by the kids, of the engagement through the parents. So that's a good sort of opportunity for discernment. Is this information that we're measuring, that we're going out to get, is it useful? Is it representative? What is it representative of?
Well, and I think too, and I'd be curious to know how kind of our audience is thinking about this, and what they've seen. But I think now there's an opportunity for the practitioners who are operating micro schools to kind of get their story out there a little more. Now, some folks are doing this. We interviewed about this time last year Carrie McDonald, and she does a great job of telling many of these stories. But these stories have got to get out there, because if people aren't familiar with at least one micro school, then who knows what expectations they're going to place on that, right?
Totally.
And if you're trying to measure a 15-student micro school the same way that you would evaluate the efficacy and the quality of an 80,000
Los Angeles Unified
student, 500,000 student district, right? It is going to be a total mismatch.
Totally.
And so, I'd be really curious as to how many of our listeners have actually ever been to a micro school.
Yep.
Right. And maybe that's my encouragement is like, get out there and see one so that you can, kind of kick the tires a little bit and see what's happening there. And as Lauren kind of told us, if you visited one micro school, you visited one micro school.
Yeah, exactly.
Because no one is representative, but we got to get some exposure so that we can, see how they work.
And if your interest is piqued about micro schools, you can check out the other episode with Kelly Smith and
that's right. That's
to
right.
learn more about a different perspective on the topic.
Yeah. Well, why don't we stop there? I mean, lots of good things. I'm looking forward to reading the new research that's coming out of RAND.
Yep.
In November, and we'll be sure to post to that in the show notes.
Awesome.
All right.
Sounds good.
See ya.
Bye.